Why don't we go ahead and get started with our second panel. I think the first panel did a good job of kind of teeing up the discussion for this afternoon. As we got into the Q&A, we were already going to the question of, well, what are we supposed to do? So that's kind of what this panel is addressing, is what does our work look like? How do we promote religious liberty in a culture of self-invention? How do we respond to this challenge? And again, we have a really great group. Anthony Picarello will moderate a discussion between Melissa Moschella, Helen Alvaré, and Paul Scherz. Anthony is Executive Director of the St. John Paul II National Shrine. He oversees the shrine's development and coordinates relations between the shrine and the Knights of Columbus headquarters in New Haven. Prior to his work, as many of you know, he served as Associate General Secretary and General Counsel for the USCCB. He's the reason I'm working in religious liberty at the Bishops' Conference, so whether you can either blame him or praise him if you think that this is going well, because he's the one who hired me. I'm really glad that we're getting to work together again. Dr. Moschella is a professor of the practice at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. She's a lot of Notre Dame representation. She's a philosopher whose work spans the fields of ethics, political philosophy, and law. Her areas of special expertise include natural law theory, biomedical ethics, and the family, especially parental rights. She's also affiliated with the Business, Ethics, and Society program in the Mendoza School of Business, where she teaches on a regular basis. Previously, she was Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. Professor Helen Alvaré is the Robert A. Levy Endowed Chair in Law and Liberty at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. She teaches family law, law and religion, and property law, and publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, and the First Amendment religion clauses. A book that I think is essential reading if you're interested in the discussions we're having is Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, published by Catholic University of America Press. Excellent book. I guess it was just a couple of years ago that was published. And then Dr. Scherz is Our Lady of Guadalupe Professor of Theology at Notre Dame. Again, more Notre Dame. His work examines the intersection of theology, science, medicine, and technology. His interests in ethics center on the role of virtue ethics, especially Stoic virtue ethics, and moral theology. He has published articles on many topics in bioethics, such as human enhancement, genetic technology, and end-of-life ethics. So a lot of the things actually we talked about in the last panel, this is what Paul's an expert on. His books analyze issues like moral formation of scientists, the role of risk in contemporary practical reason, the ethics of precision medicine, and the ethics of artificial intelligence. So very happy to have all of these panelists. Please join me in welcoming them.
Sorry about the laptop. I left the notes on the dresser. So, thankfully, everything's available electronically as well. So, it's not news to anybody in this room that we live in a culture of self-invention in which claims about identity and also claims about morality tend to be reduced to the expression of subjective feelings and desires, and this is especially obvious in relation to gender and sexuality, where sexual self-expression based on subjective feelings and desires comes to be considered a fundamental right. Helen Alvaré has aptly called this trend sexual expressionism, but don't worry, Helen, I am not going to talk about that. I don't want to steal your thunder, and you're the expert on that, but I instead want to focus on another aspect of our subjective expressivist culture, namely how this culture tends to distort our very understanding of what religion is. And this, I think, is going to be a nice complement to Marc DeGirolami's talk this morning. This subjectivist understanding of religion also presents serious challenges to the defense of religious freedom. And just to highlight these challenges and show how much the cultural and legal landscape has changed in its appreciation of religious freedom over the past few decades, consider the fate of state and local attempts to pass religious freedom protections since the Supreme Court's same-sex marriage decision in the Obergefell case. These attempts have almost uniformly failed and have been extremely unpopular, with the media portraying them simply as bigoted efforts to license discrimination. Yet these proposed statutes are nearly identical to the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which, as Marc told us this morning, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law by President Clinton in 1993. So that's a huge change in a very short amount of time, and that change didn't come out of nowhere. The rise of sexual expressionism in the culture has contributed to it, but it's not the only factor. Instead, I think these increasingly negative cultural attitudes toward religious freedom also have their roots in our culture's move toward a flawed subjective understanding of religion itself. This understanding has been reflected in numerous works by prominent liberal political and legal theorists who criticize the notion of a right to religious freedom as such. Scholars like Brian Barry, Ronald Dworkin, Micah Schwartzman, Brian Leiter, Christopher Eisgruber, and Lawrence Sager believe that religion doesn't deserve special legal protection, but they say instead that it should be treated on a par with the many other pursuits that people consider meaningful and important in their lives. Their arguments rest on their view of religion as indistinguishable from other things that people happen to care about. Some people, like a lot of people at Notre Dame, care a lot about football. Others care a lot about religion. And on this view, there's no reason to legally privilege one of those commitments over the other. Eisgruber and Sager call this the equal liberty model, equal freedom to engage in whatever pursuits you happen to care about. And what I want to do in the remainder of my remarks here is to provide a critique of this view and a defense of the claim that religion does indeed deserve special protection in law. The fundamental flaw in the approach to religious freedom that is represented by this equal liberty model is that it fails to recognize that religion deserves special treatment because religion actually is special. That is, it's a distinct human good that plays a uniquely important, and I'll argue a governing or overarching role in a flourishing human life. Eisgruber and Sager, however, treat religion as just one among many human projects and commitments, and they make no reference to the actual goodness of those commitments. Dworkin similarly considers religious convictions as one among the many types of convictions that, in the infamous words of the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision, quote, define the attributes of personhood, and convictions that are on a par with beliefs about things like whether or not to have an abortion or to engage in sodomy. Schwartzman believes that secular doctrines that address ultimate questions, quote, cannot be distinguished from their religious counterparts. And for Barry, religion is just one belief or preference among many, and its importance depends entirely on what an individual happens to find satisfying. Some might have a taste for expensive caviar, others might have a taste for sexual activity with minors, both of these are Barry's examples, others for going to church. And while, as in the case of pedophilia, justice allows and at times requires placing limits on people's pursuit of their preferences when this violates the rights of others, in every other respect, justice requires treating all preferences equally. Now, this view of what justice requires, which is inseparable from a view about what the law should protect or promote, presumes two things, both of which I'm going to argue are false. The first thing it presumes is that religion's value is subjective, relative to the particular tastes, preferences, and values of each individual. And it presumes, second, that religion's value, even if it's objective, is not essentially distinct from or more important than the value of non-religious beliefs. In line with these assumptions, Barry, Dworkin, Eisgruber, and Sager, and so on, deny that religion deserves special protection in law and hold, either implicitly or explicitly, that the overriding value the state should protect is autonomy. This again echoes what Marc was saying this morning. And they define autonomy as the freedom to choose and pursue one's own values and commitments in life, whatever they might be, as long as this does not involve significant non-consensual harm to others. Yet if, through reason, we can understand religion as something objectively and distinctively valuable for human beings, and not only as one among many objective goods that contribute to human fulfillment, but as a good that plays an architectonic, that is a governing and structuring role in the good life, then justice, and by extension law, would require giving it special treatment in accordance with its special role in human life. So before defending the claim that religion is indeed a distinct aspect of human well-being, let me clarify what I mean by religion. And here I'm talking about religion drawing on the natural law tradition as a natural human good, as a basic human good, one among many intrinsically valuable goods that perfect us as human beings. Goods like health or knowledge or virtue or friendship, goods that we can recognize as contributing to a flourishing life, objectively speaking. Religion is one of these goods that we can recognize through reason, and it consists in knowing the truth with regard to ultimate questions of existence and meaning, and of being in harmony with that transcendent source of existence and meaning, namely with God. And this is essentially the view of religion as a natural human good, knowable as such by reason, that is found in the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom and also in Nostra Aetate. On this view, even those who ultimately deny that God exists, even atheists, I think, can nonetheless recognize the profound importance of these religious questions, of the freedom to engage in them, to explore them, and then of the freedom to order one's life in accordance with one's answers to them. Now, authors like Berry and Schwartzman and Dworkin and Eisgruber and Sager might grant that many people consider religion to be a distinct and distinctly important human good, but they might question the claim that, in fact, religion is not reducible to or interchangeable with other goods. They may also question the claim that by its very nature, religion is architectonic, that is, that it's a good that governs and structures one's pursuit of all other goods. So what is it that makes religion special and irreducible to what these liberal theorists call comprehensive secular doctrines? One distinct aspect of religion that tends to get ignored by liberal theorists, like Dworkin, for instance, is its reference to the transcendent. In his book, Religion Without God, the title, I think, tells you everything, Dworkin replaces, or at least waters down, the transcendent element of religion with references to the mystery and sublimity of nature. Other liberal theorists ignore it altogether. By contrast, on a natural law view, religious questions are unique because they regard the ultimate origins of existence and meaning. And there is therefore something distinct and distinctly important about being in right relationship with God, who is the transcendent source of all that there is. There are, of course, other planes on which we can and should order our lives. We can and should seek to have a reasonable order of priorities among the various human goods like work, family, hobbies, health, etc. We can also seek to have harmonious relationships with other people and seek to cultivate a harmony within ourselves by developing a virtuous character that integrates reason, emotion, and action. These are all orders or harmonies that it's worth pursuing. But seeking to maintain the right order between ourselves and God is on an entirely different plane from all of those other things, important as they are. The good of religion puts us on a plane that transcends these other sorts of orders that we rightly seek, and this makes religion both distinct and distinctly important. And I think this point is crucial, for it's the relationship to the transcendent, it seems to me, that is the condition sine qua non of religion's distinctiveness. And by cutting off the transcendent element, Dworkin and other liberal theorists effectively decapitate and thus kill religion understood as a distinct human good, reducing it to a combination of other human values and erasing the basis for giving it special protections in law. Now, the denial of religion's genuine distinctiveness is closely connected to the failure to recognize its uniquely overarching, pervasive, meaning-giving role in human life, a second feature of religion that I think warrants its special treatment in law. While there are, of course, other goods that contribute to human flourishing, religion is special because it can, and should, I think, govern and order the pursuit of all of those other goods. Religion is unique because in its most robust sense, it involves recognizing the existence of a transcendent being who is the source of existence and meaning in general, and thus personally of my own existence and of my own capacities, of the world in which I depend for the continuation of my existence and the development of my capacities, of the goodness of the things that my reason grasps as good, of my very ability rationally to grasp their goodness, and of my ability to pursue and enjoy those goods. Given this realization of our radical dependence on God for our existence and our capacities and everything that we recognize to be good, we can come to see that all of our actions and endeavors relate to God and his plan for us, that nothing we do can achieve its fruition without his cooperation, that all that we have and are and can do are God's gifts to us, and that we can make use of these gifts either in a way that builds up our relationship with God or in a way that damages it. As a result, without negating the distinctive value of other goods, religion is a good that is uniquely pervasive and overarching, insofar as it can govern and be at stake in every single choice that we make. And it also gives our choices an importance and meaning that they might otherwise not have. We can take care of our health, for instance, not only because we recognize health as an intrinsic aspect of our well-being, but also and at the same time because we believe that maintaining ourselves in good health will enable us to work longer and more effectively in God's service. We can pursue friendship, not only for its own sake, but also because we believe that we are all God's children and God is pleased when we reach out to one another and care for one another. It's possible, of course, for many goods to supervene on each other in this way. We can take care of our health or pursue knowledge to please our friends. But only the good of religion can govern and be implicated in every choice at every time, in every circumstance. And only the good of religion should govern, at least implicitly, every choice at every time, in every circumstance. By contrast with the good of religion, while we may take care of our health to please our friends, there's no general sense in which we'd be more fully reasonable if our pursuit of health or any other good were further ordered to or governed by the good of friendship. In other words, religion is unique in that for the person fully aware of its claims as a human good, it requires leading a morally upright life requires that religion govern and order one's overall plan of life, as well as, at least implicitly, every choice and action. So, for instance, a young person trying to decide on a particular profession should not only consider his or her particular tastes, talents, and inclinations, along with obligations to other people and the needs of society, but should also consider all of those factors in addition to and as indicators of the particular vocation that God has in mind for him or her. Further, recognizing this architectonic and pervasive role that religion should play in life considerably heightens the importance of every choice and action. For the person who is aware of the requirements of religion, lying to a friend not only damages human well-being with regard to the goods of friendship and knowledge and integrity, but also damages one's relationship to God and manifests ingratitude for God's many gifts, not least of which are one's own existence and one's very ability to make choices. The same is true of any other immoral act. The contrary can be said of morally good acts, which not only contribute to our flourishing, but also improve our relationship to God and express our gratitude to him. Further, for the religious person, even actions and choices that are morally indifferent or of little importance in themselves can take on transcendent meaning and value if done out of love for God. There's a beautiful line in St. Teresa of Avila's Book of Foundations where she exhorts the sisters to find God amidst the pots and pans in the kitchen, right? That God can be everything, even our most be everywhere and be implicated in every action, even those that humanly seem most insignificant. By contrast, the sorts of convictions that Dworkin and other liberal theorists speak of as on a par with religion lack this pervasive and transcendent governing and meaning-giving character. So it should be clear that the understanding of religion underlying the views of theorists like Berry, Dworkin, and so on is seriously deficient. They first fail to recognize that the special value of religion is something that we can grasp by reason, and that people usually do grasp unless blinded by subrational factors or teaching in the culture and so on that deforms their ability to grasp this. Second, they ignore the crucial difference between religion and the pursuit of sub-rational tastes and preferences, like the predilection for expensive caviar or the gratification of sexual desire. And third, they fail to recognize the uniquely architectonic, pervasive, and meaning-giving role that religion has in the life of someone who is aware of its demands, a role that can only be accounted for by reference to the distinctive feature of religion as seeking the truth about and ordering ourselves in relation to God understood as the transcendent source of existence and meaning. And so since these scholars' arguments against giving religion privileged treatment in law are based on these failures to recognize the true nature and distinctiveness of religion, their arguments and the policy prescriptions that flow from them are inherently flawed at their very core. And I should highlight here that although I've examined and criticized this flawed view of religion in its scholarly articulations, all of this applies as well to the subjective view of religion that is dominant in the broader culture. Now, what can be done about this, very briefly? Apart from understanding and being able to explain why this reductive, subjective view of religion is false, it also seems to me crucial for Catholics and other Christians to ensure that this subjective view does not seep into our own self-understanding of our religious identity and commitments. In our catechesis, in CCD programs, in Catholic educational institutions at all levels, in homilies, and so on, we need to be careful to speak about religion as something that is objective, that is a source of objective truths about reality and about morality, about who we are, about who God is, about the created order in general, and about how we ought to live our lives. What I see constantly in my students, and I think this is clearly a reflection of the broader culture, is an assumption that when we're talking about religious claims, we're talking about subjective feelings or customs or cultural traditions, not about claims that can actually be true or false. When I make a suggestion that religious claims can be true or false, there's like an allergic reaction in the room, right? They just can't seem to comprehend it. This is just a presumption that this has to be subjective. And this is a huge problem, and I fear that at least in some cases, my students and Catholics more generally tend to think this way, not in spite of the religious education that they have received, but to some extent because of it. So, although educational and pastoral efforts need to meet people where they are, which tends to mean talking about our faith in a way that appeals to people at the subjective level, nonetheless, I think that more efforts need to be made to ensure that we're also at the same time helping people to understand that the faith is not just something that they happen to find subjectively attractive, but instead that the teachings of the church are in fact objectively true. Thank you.
Greetings. It's so good to see so many friends here. I am sensing a theme that is going to be common, at least between Melissa, myself, and Marc, and maybe that's a sign of something. So I'm really honored to be asked to think with you on this. Obviously, the phenomenon of the culture of self-invention is one of the truly tough questions of our times, and I think the organizers are correct that it's one of the driving pressures on religious freedom. So here's my little contribution regarding this difficulty. First, in order to address what to do, I need to set up the problem of how exactly the culture of self-invention derogates religious freedom and how this manifests in some particular phenomenon we're seeing in lawmaking and litigating. This description is then going to ground my claim that there's no way to work with or work around a culture of self-invention in the religious liberty space by, for example, describing our religious freedom claims in its language or retreating to private areas. That's our theme. Only through will do, by which I mean confronting both the ecclesiological and anthropological errors and offering that we have a better way. Finally, I'm going to propose particular arguments, both for legal and communications arenas. Now, a lot of people I know here, because I worked at the USCCB, 10 years of it in communications, and maybe it won't surprise you that I'm going to talk about communications, but it surprises me, because even when I got started in the job in communications, I remember thinking, this is not smart enough for a practicing attorney. Like, this work isn't enough. It's not complicated. But I came to believe then, and believe now again, that specific attention not only to law, but also to public discourse and to being present is very important. And I'm surprising both of us by saying this. And I'm also going to say, theme here, that it might be time to speak more explicitly religiously, in addition to speaking about reason, in order to break through this current cultural moment. So first, let me set up the problem, how seeing oneself as the center of meaning and self-created is a challenge that takes a direct shot at the heart of religious freedom. Painting with a broad brush, I would say this is because in such a culture, first, there is no God, or if there is, he's just a projection of my needs and wants. If there is a God, he's not anything like a sovereign over creation, including my body, which means my body has no sacred quality. Relationships are less willing the good of the other and more hedonic exchange. That is, looking for someone who enjoys what I enjoy, because when we do it together, both of us gets more enjoyment out of it, and it's more fun to be with people. And fourth, that perhaps the most important thing about the self, about identity, is the sexual. Okay? You may have read, there's a couple of marvelous authors that have addressed this in two very different books. Carl Trueman, the religious historian, in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, talks about the move in intellectual history and culture from community to individual, individual as sexual, sexual as political, right? It's at the heart of people's notion of identity, and therefore the personal becomes political. That's our politics. And second, a book you may not have stumbled across, but wow, it's by the Chicago priest named Father Louis Camelli. And he talks about the progression. It's called Catholic Teaching on Homosexuality, where he really lays it out in a way that's both theologically accurate and pastorally sensitive. And he talks about the current stage of human inquiry. You know, we move from going, wow, Jesus, human and divine, what's that? To, oh, there's three of them. What's the Trinity, right? And now it's all anthropological, and it's boiled down to the sexual self, right? It's the center of things. So really good observations in both of those books. So if these are your beliefs, what are the religious freedom ramifications? Another way of saying it is, how did we get to the point where a teacher at a religious university who signs up and down on her contracts to abide by the mission then sues them when they fire her for declaring her cohabitation openly and wins on the grounds that she has actually been discriminated against on the basis of her marital status? They wouldn't treat a married person like this if they were living with someone and had 3 kids. She wins on the claim that she has a civil right to work at a school whose mission she diametrically opposes. And let's not forget that the Christian students at this place get out with placards that say things like, "Who would Jesus fire?" Okay? So how did we get to that point? So here's what I think are the ramifications for religious freedom for a person having adopted this cultural mindset. First, religion is not important, or as has been described already by Melissa this morning also, that religion is only a personal identity marker. That's been well explored. You will simply not grasp how an institution could claim religious freedom. You think religious freedom, to the extent an institution has it, it's because individuals have religious freedom and they work there and it's protecting their individual religious freedom. Remember the furor, the backlash to the Hobby Lobby opinion when they said, a small family-held corporation had religious freedom. The fury that one could acknowledge that an institution has religious freedom, right? Because in the mind of the self-inventor, there's nothing outside yourself, right? There's not institutional anything. It's my individual religious freedom. What do you mean something has it over against me? Next, not only because religious institutions are not embracing the new sexual orthodoxy, but also because the government is and is fueling this culture of self-invention, you'll be more inclined to see religion as the oppressor and the government coming to the rescue with its civil rights laws. Also, because you see yourself as the sum total of your choices, you will not understand the difference between a religious person or institution refusing to bless your choices or cooperate with them, right? House the cohabiting couple, ensure the same-sex partner, put forward as a religion teacher someone who opposes the church. You won't understand the difference between status discrimination and a refusal to cooperate with or even support your conduct and some kind of hatred of your identity. And finally, you will see not only your sexual choices, but your choice of work as an extension of yourself. So the idea that you're a minister of a mission will make no sense to you at all. And this quote so perfectly captured it in a recent North Carolina case involving a teacher let go from a religious school after announcing his same-sex marriage. He stated he wanted nothing more than the freedom to perform his duties as an educator without hiding who he loves. Again, nothing about the institution. There is no we, there is no institution, there is no ministry in that. It's, I am expressing myself as a teacher, and you're just the host place that pays me to do it. So from this, we get the particular phenomenon we're witnessing in the religious freedom space, obviously a proliferation of lawsuits by people openly opposed to us. Second, contests made to seem extremely personal. You won't support my choices, you hate me. You also get the ridiculous status conduct debate I've referred to, where laws ban discrimination on the basis of, say, sexual orientation or gender identity. And a florist says, hey, I hire and, support the birthday parties and everything else of same-sex attracted people. I just want to celebrate their wedding. And they're told, no, refusal to cooperate with conduct equals discrimination against status. And I've written a big article about that. It infuriates me. You also get denials that dissenting employees, including religion teachers or ministers of any mission, or that the institution has any right qua institution. And finally, you get the latest thing you're seeing, like that Wisconsin case about Catholic charities, that religious organizations are not religious, on the grounds that, well, they're just doing social services that the states do. And this is highly visible in the law review literature, where there are women who make their whole careers going after the bona fides of Catholic institutions. Elizabeth Sepper with her famous Zombie Institutions article about Catholic hospitals, and more recently, Elizabeth Katz against Catholic foster care. She just put out a huge diatribe. So how to respond? Well, in the mindset of self-inventors, there's no reason that your idiosyncratic religion should trump my identity, no mission outside of my own personal project, and no refusal to cooperate with my conduct that's not an attack on my identity. So I think it takes more here to improve our situation in the long run than recognizing even our currently pretty strong legal rights in ministerial exemption, church autonomy. Sometimes we get strict scrutiny. I think it's time for us to get more communicative, in a voice that's both faith and reason, sometimes even leading with faith, which is not something that I used to do in the abortion debate, but I'm feeling increasingly strongly about it. And this communication should in particular do two things: explain the ecclesiology of our institutions and the anthropology of persons in romantic and familial relationships. It should also do this confidently and repeatedly to a world who is, and I think Carl Trueman and the law professor Stephen Smith explained this, is more like the 2nd century than we'd like to admit. It's a place where Catholics have to begin to explain who they are in a culture that has absolutely no clue, has really lost a common language for that. It's like we're beginning again. I agree with some recent marvelous scholars on this. I urge you to read them, as I said. Stephen Smith and Carl Trueman writes about it too. So first, about doing it. I think we need to tell people what our institutions really are, whether we're speaking in a court of law or public opinion. And don't be fooled, our Catholics need to hear it too. They are very much lost on this. Even our own Catholics think, as the words of Pope Francis at his first Mass in Sancta Marta, that we're just another NGO, right? Albeit one with a heart. Somehow we got together and we called it St. Vincent's Hospital. We don't know why we named it after a saint. We just wanted to get together and do something nice, right? No, we have to reform this understanding of our institutions. What I suggest in my book is threefold, as ones I think are easily to communicate in court and in public opinion. First, that we're communities of persons gathered together to serve, arising out of the common belief that Jesus is our Lord and Savior, and has clearly modeled for us and exhorted us forcefully to teach, to heal, and to serve the most vulnerable. Second, that we're persons committed to making Christ present in the world today. Here I steal robustly from one of my favorite theologians, Luigi Giussani, who was talking about that famous Italian novel, The Betrothed. And he's talking about the confrontation between Cardinal Borromeo and Father Abbondio, who has not witnessed Christ very well to a couple and sent them fleeing through Italy during the time of the plague to their detriment. And Cardinal Borromeo catches up with them and he says, "How do you think anyone knew that Christ was alive? How do you think they knew he was Christ? Because he was too good to be true. He was brilliant without being arrogant. He was powerful without being harsh. And he says to him, if you're not too good to be true, then Christ is nothing but a 2,000-year-old memory." It's also from that book, my only tattoo. That book made a big impression on me. I just feel so strongly that that is a model that people can bring into their own lives, modeling Christ to the world. And finally, that Christians are a group of people living out Christ's first commands to love God and our neighbor in such a way as to provide people a glimpse of the kingdom of God, right? In such a way as to provide the glimpse of what, I think it was Tertullian said, look at how those Christians love one another. And look at how they love everyone. For them, charity is not a matter of serving other Roman citizens or noblesse oblige. It's everyone is a citizen of the kingdom of God. And in concert with these particular expressions of who we are in our Catholic institutions, I think we should point out to people that they should not be surprised when we make radical demands about how we're supposed to love one another. Whether we're speaking of the love we're supposed to show the stranger on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, or the love we're required to show people on the way to the bathroom in the kitchen in the morning, right? The Good Samaritan, those people strewn on our path, Good Samaritan style, most frequently, who we are most likely to affect indelibly, romantic partners and family members. As Benedict says in Deus Caritas Est, there should be no difference in our treatment. Christian love is indivisible. And what does this love look like? I would highlight a few qualities of it. You know, God did not just love a little better than we do. He wasn't just marginally better at it than we are. He is God who becomes man. He dies a ghastly death for the likes of us. He heals the sick and the grief-stricken. He is sovereign over a good creation, including our bodies made in his image, all of which is tinged with the divine. This is radical stuff. And it is no coincidence that, in the words of Peter Brown, the great Princeton historian, those early church fathers who preached most intently on Christian chastity also preached most intently on our obligation to help the poor. Peter Brown says that Christian love must be tinged with a measure of heroic démesure, that is, absolute over the top. Therefore, in Christianity, you get martyrdom. You get chastity for the sake of the kingdom. You get celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. You get stuff that that Roman world had not really thought about, okay? You get a radical kind of love. Now, we have several advantages in this line of argument. First, it's intrinsically arresting. I mean, this is interesting stuff. I mean, there's a reason, you know. I think it was so funny. Who was that? Christopher Hitchens, who said, what are the odds that Jesus was God? I mean, he comes to a small corner of the world, you know, at a time with no mass communications. It's like, Christopher, don't you get the joke? He arrested the attention of the whole world. This stuff is intrinsically arresting. Second, it validates the importance of the body as more than a tool for self-expression or others' exploitation. I think it gives voice to people's intuition that the body has, and they wouldn't use the word, but they might, even in a secular sphere, a sacred quality. Remember the Me Too fight? That wasn't about like a boss demanding his female secretary, you know, take his clothes to the dry cleaner and serve him breakfast. It was about sexual touch of her body. Okay? People know the body has a sacred quality, especially in the sexual realm. Furthermore, such language not only gives people a reason for loving one's neighbor way above and beyond current noble social justice tropes, but again, to rely on Chisani also, it answers people's natural longings for intense love, for justice, for really being the apple of someone else's eye, for hope, for meaning. And finally, it has the advantage, and here again, back to objective reality, of jiving with the fast-growing body of empirical data. Data, for example, from the very longest ever study of human happiness from Harvard University that demonstrates that close, faithful, familial, and friendship relationships are the most important ingredient in happiness. Data showing the harm to children of their parents' cohabitation, of divorce, of single parenting. Data that altogether show that radical Christian love is a crucial and really irreplaceable path to children's, which means the country's, well-being, and also holds an important key to closing the gaps we see in American society between the rich and the poor, between the races, between generations of immigrants, which are largely driven by family stability. I'm suggesting, therefore, that we break through the current culture of self-invention with fresh language explaining ourselves religiously and giving hope for human happiness and health, as well as the reasons for it. Let me give you two quick examples. Okay, I have like 2 more minutes and I'm not going over time. Let me give you 2 quick examples of, interestingly, where this has worked in litigation. One is the Wisconsin versus Yoder case. Some of you may be familiar. The Amish didn't want to send their kids to school for an extra couple of years. And the state says, you gotta, because we need these kids to be self-sufficient and to be intelligent participants in the democracy. And the court goes, oh wait, the Amish do that better. And then there's another famous case, the Rader case, about a public college requiring freshmen to live in an on-campus dorm, forbade them from living in a Christian house across the street. The college claimed a compelling state interest in fostering pluralistic interaction and mutual interpersonal acceptance, but in an opinion upholding the students' right to live in a Christian dorm, the court says, oh wait, Christian housing actually does that better. They have a more racially diverse and international group of people and fostered more of a unity among diversity. So I am arguing that we say we have the better way. I mean, we think that. We don't have to be, and I know tone is important, you don't have to be triumphalistic in your manner, but you do have to put together our own brilliant language, understanding of the human person, with empirical data, okay? 2 things, and then close. Let me say a word about how this intersects with our current reputation for sexual abuse of minors, right? I think we have to own up front when we do that, and we're going to be ridiculed, to say, we're willing to take our licks on this. We have come a long way. We have done a great deal. We know we're going to be attacked when we speak on these subjects, but it's too important not to speak on them anyway. And we will both deal with internal problems, which we have been doing, a lot, but we will also not disappoint the culture. When Catholics leave the field, it's a way impoverished conversation, and we know that, and we won't do that. Everything I've said is upstream of lobbying for a particular law or decrying it or even participating in litigation. But I think when we're up against a culture that's this ingrained, I think we got to do a lot of upstream work before we can begin to see more success in these other arenas. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm so happy to be speaking with you today and with this great group of other speakers. It's such a wonderful event. Today I've been tasked with speaking about technology. As Dr. Favale said, it's essential to the culture of self-invention. So I'm going to be talking about technology, its role in moral formation in our culture, and what do we do about that. And it's important because technology and the self are intimately connected. People craft their identities through technology. Consider the social media profile, the most direct way of projecting oneself into the world. It allows social media users to explicitly narrate their identity and continually manage it with posts that support that self-narrative. or at a more permanent level, biomedical technologies further self-invention through surgeries and medication intervening upon the body to bring an identity into existence. So I want to focus on the role of technology in two steps of this process of self-invention. First, technologies, especially biomedical technologies, are essential to bringing many new identities into existence. Second, because these identities rarely come from nowhere, people use information technologies to discover the content of the new self that they seek to create, to invent. My criticism is not directed at all technology, nor even at all the uses of the particular technologies of which I will speak. However, to confront the culture of self-invention will require us to address the specific technologies upon which it depends. But before getting into the meat of my argument, I think it's important to recognize the good instincts that underlie many of the modern desires to form new selves, if we hope to respond to these movements. In and of itself, the desire to escape the limitations and corruptions of our current existence is a healthy and even Christian impulse. We are all sinful and called to conversion, to become a new creation. And Christians seek to change themselves through ongoing prayer, asceticism, devotional practices, and so on. These practices were understood in ancient philosophy and patristic Christianity as an art of living, a techne, that helps someone craft himself into a new person. These classical techniques of the self differed from today's self-invention, though, because this earlier techne primarily aimed at removing vice. Pierre Hadot describes how moral formation was envisioned in terms of ancient ideas of sculpture, in which sculptors remove rocks in order to reveal the figure buried in the stone. Something like how Michelangelo's unfinished statues, you can see the figure kind of bursting out of the rock around them. Spiritual writers describe the exercises of the purgative way similarly, and you get metaphors from people like Gregory of Nyssa as moral formation as polishing the mirror of our soul so that we can better reflect God's light. The new self is formed by removing vicious habits. So many of our contemporaries also seek to become something different. They find themselves dissatisfied with the world and themselves, suffering from loneliness, mental distress, anxiety, failed relationships, and career disappointment. Many pursue transformation through traditional techniques, which is giving the current secular popularity of Stoicism, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the like. More interesting, though, for our conversation today, is the attempt to find a shortcut to a new self through technologies that act upon our bodies, that construct actively something new. The most extreme examples of this technological self-invention are the transhumanists. Tech entrepreneurs are pouring billions of dollars into startups promising life extension, neural implants, and brain-computer interfaces. Their goal is to escape the physical and cognitive limitations of our embodied selves by merging with machines. Transhumanists envision a future in which they will live forever as virtual or robotic avatars, whose AI-augmented software will correct our faulty reasoning. Already, biohackers are implanting devices of their own making under their skin to accelerate their convergence with machines. Augmented reality headsets are driving us towards a virtual world of self-creation, and tech companies are marketing neural devices that modify traits like attention. And other people are arguing for a right to try all of these kinds of technologies and medications on themselves. Transhumanists are admittedly an extreme case. But there are other more common instances of the use of medical technologies to reform the self. Gender transition surgeries, for example, attempt to transform the body so that it will conform to an interior view of who the self should be. Sociologist Joseph Davis describes how people use neuropharmaceuticals to address everyday suffering. Now, I should emphasize that he's not describing cases of people treating major mental disorders of the sort for which these drugs were designed, but of people using them to address more common disappointments of breakups, struggles in schools, social awkwardness. Davis describes his research subjects as trying to craft more viable selves in the face of everyday failure. Concerns about the self that in former times might have led to a turn to philosophy or faith today are addressed through biomedical technologies. Now, two aspects of this turn to biotechnology are important for Catholic thought. First, this technological crafting of the self is generally tied to a negative vision of the body. it's faulty neurobiology that causes our failures, or a mismatch between our actual body and our self-image that accounts for one's alienation. At a deeper level, though, it manifests as a concern with embodiment altogether. Journalist Mark O'Connell quotes one biohacker who says, quote, "I'm trapped in this body. Ask anyone who's transgender, they'll tell you they're trapped in the wrong body. But me, I'm trapped in the wrong body because I'm trapped in a body. All bodies are the wrong bodies." So this negative vision of the body arises from many sources. I mean, first, there's merely the awkwardness of being an embodied self, disease, struggles with weight, and so forth. But technology also plays a role in today's concerns with embodiment. A culture of comparison on social media involves constantly posting and rating pictures is tending to degrade young people's body image, especially young women's. Moreover, so many of our interactions and experiences are quasi-disembodied, from only communicating with friends through texts to playing video games as one's sole recreation. People are living virtually, and so they feel few of the joys of embodiment, but experience many of its burdens. In its disgust with the body, the culture of self-invention imitates Gnostic or Platonic dualist views of the body, and technology offers an escape from that current body. But a second point to note is that these doubts about the body don't lead to a trust in the mind or spirit, as in Platonism. Rather, phenomenological experience is seen as just as problematic as the body. So people seek external professional validation for their new selves, or objectified quantitative metrics, or institutional recognition. They seek a self that can be evaluated from the outside, from likes on social media, from objective metrics of success, or from a medical diagnosis. This objectifying aspect of self-invention is most obvious in the quantified self movement, a group who feels they can only truly know themselves through their numbers, so they track everything from sleep to heart rate to emotional changes. This form of quantified relationship to the body has become mainstream through wearable devices like the Fitbit or Oura Ring. In this way, the culture of self-invention applies the objectifying mathematical worldview of contemporary technology, what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, to the self. So we have a culture of self-invention that arises from a disgust with the body, a disgust in part caused by technology itself, and then it uses technology to manipulate the refractory body to achieve the self desired by the autonomous will. And finally, it judges the success of this transformation through technoscientific metrics. Technology is going all the way through. Yet this smooth cycle faces the question of how to choose what sort of self to invent. And here I come to the second part of my comments. The problem is that autonomously choosing a new self cannot be completely arbitrary, because such an arbitrary choice would be meaningless, is a point made by C.S. Lewis and the CDF in some of its writings on enhancement. There's a sad undertone to many of the writings of transhumanists who are vague about the actual benefits of living as a machine. They don't know what they're going to do with their extra lifespan. There might be a few Nietzschean geniuses who take joy in the pure act of artistic self-invention, but most people want a deeper meaning for their actions. In the ancient world, this choice of a self was a choice to be a philosopher, or the Christian adoption of a life of faith. In both cases, the new self aligned with the tradition that gave it meaning. However, there was also an individual aspect. The ancient quest to care for the self through spiritual techniques was always tied to the Delphic admonition to know thyself. In part, knowing oneself just meant knowing that you are a human, a mortal whose soul is ordered towards wisdom. Yet there were more personal aspects of self-knowledge. Cicero, for example, said that one must consider one's characteristics before choosing a form of life. This focus on knowing thyself underwent a change in modernity, leading to the romantic demand for authenticity. In this modern vision, there is a unique core to the self to which we must be true. One crafts oneself in line with this authentic self. Now, Christianity also contains aspects of this focus on the individual self. Ambrose followed Cicero in looking to personal aspects of duty. Ignatian discernment looks for God's will for the person. And Edith Stein envisions a personal kernel of being that is unique to each of us that we are called to unfold in accordance with God's will. God calls each of us by name and asks us to use our unique talents in his service. Many people today seek inside themselves for a true self in order to escape the inauthentic lives they think cause their unhappiness. They seek their true gender, their real personality covered over by neurochemical defects, or to uncover their true potential. Yet finding a true self is difficult. The fear is rather than crafting ourselves in relation to truth, we might invent ourselves to accord with falsehood. The spiritual masters have long worried about the dangers of introspection, insofar as Satan can appear as an angel of light. Technology can be a snare on this path to finding one's authentic calling. It has long been used to support consumerism, with, for example, public relations experts deploying mass media to propose forms of life to emulate. PR experts know that the best way to sell a product is to tie it to a vision of life that can be a target for self-invention. People may think that they are inventing their own views, but really they merely fall under the hidden sway of those who own the media. Social media has created new dangers to self-discovery due to the way the attention economy works. Social media companies are no longer trying to sell specific products or lifestyles. Instead, they are merely trying to get users to stay on the platform for as long as possible. This increases the danger of distraction, drawing one away from attending to oneself to attend to a stream of images, but it also increases the flow of false selves that are displayed to people. Social media algorithms can create a distorted interiority by drawing on, intensifying, and transforming a person's desires and characteristics. To take TikTok's algorithm, for example, it works in part by analyzing how much time you linger or pause on a video. If you pause on something, even if not intentionally, the algorithm will push more of that kind of content into your feed. As one watches more of it, you can go down a rabbit hole of getting ever more extreme and intense content. A feedback loop accelerates between whatever desire the algorithm happens to identify at that first moment and the person's viewing habits. As they watch more content, people start to understand themselves in a different way, seeing the algorithms as revealing a true self. There's a plethora of blog posts and articles online about young women who find that the algorithm starts pushing them lesbian content, and then eventually they start to understand themselves as having a transformed sexuality. Other people find themselves watching content directing them to a new gender identity, others to a new extreme political identity. In a different vein, many people self-diagnose a mental disorder from watching videos on YouTube or TikTok, which is driving psychiatrists crazy because this is not how you diagnose things, and many of the things they diagnose themselves with are psychiatric disorders that actually don't exist in the psychiatric literature. So in these examples, the algorithm is leading a process of discernment by which people interpret what their true self is. So here we see a distortion of spiritual discernment. The person no longer discerns fundamental gifts and talents in order to use them to conform to God's will for his life. Instead, we read ourselves as destined to embody whatever desire is isolated by the algorithms. As philosophers Anton Barbaquet and Shannon Valor argue, social media is acting as a mirror of Narcissus. In that myth, the beautiful boy Narcissus becomes so beguiled with his own reflection in a pond that he can't tear himself away and eventually dies. Similarly, social media reflects aspects of ourselves, and we become enchanted with them. It is a distorting mirror, though, one that reflects only some aspects of our current self. The problem is that we can mistake that distorted reflection for our authentic self. And this mistake is encouraged by the seemingly objective nature of the algorithm. The result that can be that youths try to invent themselves in the image of the self they see in their feed. The spiritual director of this process of self-invention is the algorithm. Of course, desires revealed by social media are a thin thread on which to hang an identity. Thus, people demand that everyone, including institutions, affirm those identities, and they seek to embed them in their bodies. Doubts about the invented self threaten to undermine its credibility, even in the person's own eyes. So, as other speakers have noted, the refusals of other people to technologically implement an identity through surgery or medication can become an attack on the self that cannot be tolerated. It is this demand that creates dangers for religious liberty. So given these dangers of technology, what should we do? Well, a first set of responses are purely negative. We need to minimize the use of social media, especially among the young, through legislative and regulatory means if necessary. I would think that Christians should join with lawmakers across the political spectrum proposing laws to do so. I mean, this is very popular bipartisanly. Christians should also continue to work against the biomedical technologies that feed the culture of self-invention. There are also defensive actions that individuals should take. When one uses technologies like social media, then one must do so knowing something of how they work, how they seek to grasp attention by exploiting desire. Users must learn to guard their eyes, keeping far from content that can be used to exploit them. Since these algorithms act in many ways as mirrors, magnifying the qualities and desires that one brings to them, a user should bring his best self online, consciously projecting into the algorithm the person he wants to be, so that these aspects of himself will be reinforced. What is gravely needed is a catechesis for technology and technology use. There are also positive steps to take, such as recreating an offline world. Pope Francis has repeatedly called us to engage in concrete, embodied communities that allow for the interpersonal encounters that will truly help us to know ourselves. As Francis says, quote, "So often in life we waste time asking, 'Who am I?' You can keep asking, 'Who am I?' for the rest of your lives. But the real question is, for whom am I?" Yet opportunities for such encounters are decreasing in the world. The church needs to build parish communities that allow for encounter through social groups shaped around age, vocation, devotion, and so on. Now, don't misunderstand me. The point is not to create a sectarian Catholic culture in contradiction to a secular one, but to create a real world to stand against a virtual one. A second constructive step addresses the positive instincts driving the culture of self-invention. People are desperately seeking for themselves and for how to live better in a sinful and technocratic world. The church can show them a broader vision of transformation through the imitation of Christ and all the other things that Dr. Alvaré mentioned. But the Catholic tradition also has more concrete tools of discernment, ascetic practices, and spiritual direction that can assist people. The Synod on Youth was wise in calling for making resources for discernment available to the young. People who, quote, "navigate simultaneously on 2 or more screens and interact at the same time with 2 or 3 virtual scenarios can easily become prey to every passing trend. Discernment is necessary to decide whether some novelty is new wine brought by God or an illusion created by the spirit of this world or the spirit of the devil." So providing the wisdom of discernment can make a great difference in people's lives. Finally, technology can be a great tool for making people aware of these resources in the tradition. There's lots of people out there, podcasts and apps that are introducing people to daily prayer, daily scripture, and other classical techniques of the self. Take something from my own research on the art of dying tradition. Like, students were amazed that there was an app they could get that would remind them 5 times a day that they're going to die. It would send you a text. These efforts should be encouraged and expanded. But I would also say that these tools should also direct people to their parishes. I know many people who I've talked to who are coming back to the church who will listen to all these tools, but then have a hard time taking that last step of actually getting into community. So redirecting people toward a constructive mode of moral formation will be difficult given the powerful lure of contemporary technologies and the confusion felt by many in the world around us. Yet the church has the tools to take advantage of the instincts driving the turn to self-invention and redirect them to the good end of spiritual formation. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all our panelists, and let me take a moment also to thank Aaron right there for putting this whole thing together. I'm very grateful for his efforts and for his honoring us with bringing it here to the shrine. So thank you very much. I have just a few questions to invite some conversation, but really I'd like to make sure that the folks gathered have an opportunity. Let me begin with a quick one. The distinction between affirmative support and prohibition is something that came up in 2 of the talks, and this has been something that has always puzzled me, that if you are not helping someone, you're restricting someone. Then you are not merely, far from being a victim of some sort of religious liberty infringement, you're the perpetrator at that point. And Helen's point especially was that the culture of self-invention is part of what blinds people to that distinction. I'm interested in hearing more about that, because it's not obvious to me why that's true. And I've always been kind of looking for a cause. How is it that people continually miss this over and over again? So I guess I would just invite for Helen and then others to reflect on that a bit further.
So what I would say...
There we go. If you think that your acts constitute yourself and your choices constitute yourself, then when somebody says, as they did, this was the Richardson case, Northwest Christian University, but there's hundreds of them, my living with my boyfriend is part of what makes me me, right? This is how I roll. This is my being a woman. This is my being free. This is how I want to do relationships. So if you say and the college offered her the choice that said either, you made a promise, either move out or you're going to have to leave, or marry him, just please, you're telling all these female students what you're doing and we can't have that. And she was like, no, you have to employ me, and I'm going to continue to be this and talk about this. Same way with landlords and cohabiting couples. You have to give them the bedroom, right? Catholic landlord. Because their choice to do this makes them the person that they are. Mm-hmm. And so they really can't see the difference between, and I think, is it pronounced Scherz? There, I think Professor Scherz makes the sort of underlying argument in how technology reinforces this, but I think it's just a mindset, and they want external validation, but it's also self-constituting. So they can't separate out my status as a single person doing this from your refusal to give me the bedroom to do it.
I completely agree with that. And I think also, part of the point that I was trying to make was that it's just, if my identity is as a Christian in the part of the church, I've got a baptismal certificate, I've got this church around me, you can't say, well, maybe that's not true, maybe that's not who you are, right? Because, there's a lot of kind of communal support. If you are creating your own self and have no kinds of things in the world, that's an attack on self-identity in a major way, in a different way than because identity is more fragile than it is for someone who takes their identity from being a Catholic, for example.
So even if it's not strictly a restriction, because it's an attack, it feels so aggressive that it's much like what the government does in saying no at the point of a gun.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I would also add to that that this then gets confused with, then you get the flip, right, of almost the university that's seeking to uphold its religious freedom to carry out its mission is now being said that they're violating the religious freedom of the person on the other side who's actually attacking it. But this is, again, because there isn't an ability to distinguish between a genuine religious liberty claim and any other identity claim. But then I think actually the other there in that previous phrase is problematic. So I think sometimes even in the church's own litigation efforts, part of this is just you have to use the language that will win you the case, but then it can be a Pyrrhic victory of it, is that we can start to use the identity language to refer to our own claims, that this is my sincere religious identity or my sincerely held religious belief in a way that sounds completely subjective, right? There's even some work by Doug Laycock and Tom Berg that argues in favor of religious freedom, but I think in a way that's really problematic, that says, well, we should start using the same kind of identity language that the LGBTQ people use with reference to religious freedom, and then we can win on that basis. And I think this is a terrible idea because they're actually completely different things. But you see the confusion. Once you reduce one to the other, there's actually no winning ever for religious freedom. So we have to go back to the idea that religion isn't primarily an identity. It is, but it's not primarily that. I think frankly, James Madison had a very good definition of religion when he said in drafting in the Virginia Constitution that it's the duty you owe to your creator. It's not primarily an identity. It's primarily a set of duties. Truth claims that we then have a duty to adhere to as soon as we recognize them to be true, and then truth claims about how we should live that we then have a duty to act in accordance with. But I think this recognizing it as a matter of duty then also helps distinguish between the identity claim, because it's not so much I have a right to affirmation of who I take myself to be as I have a right to fulfill the duties that I believe I am absolutely required to fulfill vis-a-vis my creator who's making these demands on me. They're not even duties that I impose on myself. They're duties that I take to come from the outside, imposed on me. And I think that also helps to make this important distinction.
Could I layer on that? I did this article. It's not coming out till the spring. It's in Brigham Young's Law Review. And I went through and I found every positive statement the Supreme Court had ever made about why religious freedom is a good thing in the United States. And the LGBTQ and abortion cases are one thing where you get a totally different set of lingo. But this idea, it's surprising how long it's persisted into the current time. You find language even in the Fulton case, which is that Philadelphia Catholic Charities same-sex adoption case, about, the foster care as a point of light, because they actually say they feel they have a duty to do this. And it also turns out this duty is this great service to the common good. So I pointed out that from the earliest cases, and there aren't a lot because the free exercise was not what we call incorporated to the states for a while, so you only had a few cases in the states. But the language is still there. So it's just been totally distorted in the sexual expression cases, sex, marriage, and parenting. But from the early 1800s to even a couple of years ago, it's somewhere preserved in Supreme Court jurisprudence that religion is about a duty out to the other, and one that often results in great public goods.
If I could build on that and refocus us on this topic of what distinguishes religion from other expensive tastes, as I know one scholar has put it. You referenced now, Helen, and Professor Moschella as well, the reference to duty that exists in the jurisprudence, again, Madison, other places, even the Catholic tradition, that's familiar. But also, Professor Moschella, you've referenced some of these other terms that seem to be, sort of discrete, definitional, oriented toward kind of giving a functional legal definition. So, for example, God or not, right? In other words, transcendent. That's binary. It's administrable. This idea of like governance, comprehensiveness, that's discernible in some way. Well, first of all, I'm interested in hearing more about that from you and others. I think that that's an interesting strategy because I do think that this kind of recalls this idea of, when talking about do we supply another religious freedom standard after Smith and so forth? I think supplying a definition of religion that will sort of shore it up and enable it to have special protection is a good and important enterprise. So that's one thing. But I'm also interested in how that contrasts with the approach that Professor Alvaré indicated of just kind of grabbing people by the gut, just hitting them with
rhetorically.
That's right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
rhetorically.
Again, the other sort of legal cliche that comes to my mind is, you'll know it when you see it, right? So in other words, we do this because we love Jesus, well, the justice will be like, yeah, that's religious. I can't give you the definition. I can't tell you why this isn't, that other thing isn't, but I know at least that this thing is. So again, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about both of those aspects, if you would.
I mean, I think for purposes of law, you do need some sort of distinguishing criteria, and I completely agree with everything Helen said, but that's upstream of the legal stuff, right? That's the cultural battle that, frankly, if we lose that, no number of legal arguments is going to do it
But
for
I would
us,
put
so,
it in the legal
yeah.
argument too. I just want to say
Yeah.
I would not too much theology for a judge, but enough to say, which is not a lot, but which is clearly religious language. But anyway, I would put it there too.
Right. I think your example of the Yoder, the Amish case, is important. You have to make the case that what you're doing, even if the judges say they're not going to make decisions on the basis of any of their own judgments about the goodness or truth or whatever of of the religion on the merits, it will influence them. So if you can make a clear-cut case that what you're doing actually makes some sense and contributes to the common good, more broadly understood, and contributes to whatever the relevant state interest is. I mean, in the case of the Amish, it was interest in educating self-sufficient, law-abiding citizens, and the Amish could say, well, we actually do that better than your public schools do, so you're not really losing anything by letting us educate the kids at home for the last 2 years of their compulsory schooling, and so they won that. But yes, I think on the distinguishing religion and law thing, I mean, I think things like some transcendent reference, right? Some God who is not reducible to just, the mystery of nature or, something like that. Some clear transcendent reference, something that's not purely self-invented, some sense that it's coming from the outside, imposing duties. I also think Marc DeGirolami's point about the group nature, that's something I didn't talk about, but I think that's very important to what it means to be a religion. It's not simply an individual thing. I mean, I think conscience protections are important, but they're not the same as religion, and I think there's a reason why, and there's clearly historical reasons. This court is very originalist. There are clearly historical reasons why the language, I just listened to a marvelous lecture on going through like 30 different versions of the possible language that could have entered into the First Amendment and what actually got there in the religion clauses. And every single state had proposed a version of the religion clauses that had conscience in addition to religious protections. And that was clearly left out on purpose. This is very interesting. I mean, I think because they didn't want a proliferation of claims, right? Individual conscience could end up being anything. And so while there was a concern for conscience, they thought, well, let's leave that to the legislature. In terms of what is going to go into the amendment, it's religion. Now, they also neglected to define it. Madison had put on the table his definition, and they didn't want to define it. So anyway, this is tricky history. But nonetheless, I think that something like a Madisonian definition, duty to the creator, which implies a transcendent. Also, I think if you look at the original understanding and the original context, there would have been an understanding that we're dealing with a group, right, a tradition, not just an individual idiosyncratic thing. And we see that courts have done tests like this, like in the cases during the war with the draft, with conscientious objectors. They went through. Now those are complicated, but they did try to apply some kind of tests, and they did try to apply something like, is there some transcendent thing? Right. I know they they were a little shifty there, but they tried. So they have done this in the past.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of what's behind my question is that these things might be these two strategy or tactics, I should say, might be in tension with each other. In other words, when you're kind of putting forward these sort of relatively practical, administrable, definitional terms, particularly those focused on objective characteristics on the one hand, and then you're appealing kind of to the Christian narrative and sort of a particular tradition on the other. I understand you want to do both, but I don't know. Do you do both in the same case?
See, I think
the alternative?
they're completely overlapping.
Yeah, I agree.
To me, I don't see when you're making the Christian case, you're explaining this is a duty to God, this is scriptural, this is tradition. You're fulfilling it, and you may be describing a little bit more about it in an appealing way, but it's exactly the same as talking about duties to a transcendent being. Mm-hmm. I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wonder if I'm thinking about particular audiences, and maybe it's just a matter of like this judge will find this appealing, the other one won't.
I think you can't say. I remember saying this to Kevin Walsh. He was in the Little Sisters of the Poor litigation, and he was like, "Wow, we had to fulfill the responsibility to say there was a burden on our religious freedom. We had to name a rule. You can't just name the rule. We can't provide contraception. I mean, that gets you a big audience, right? Oh, we love those people. Right. That's so attractive. It has to be the why.
Sure.
So you're talking about your duties, but you're talking about the duties in a way that says this is radical love. This is respect for natural world. This is respect for the woman. This is non-exploitative. This is healthy. So if you're thinking about just like this is a duty, this is a rule, no, I would never stop there. I would be explaining that this is not moralism, a bunch of rules. This is a response in love to an offer of love. Which is how we understand, I think, our moral theology. I just checked that with the moral theologian. So if you're thinking I was just going to go full out rule-based, no.
Right. And then the idea is that also manifests that the basis for that rule is religious in nature, right?
Yes.
So
Right.
it's,
And happens to be reasonable in promoting of the common good in an objective way.
And just to plug for your own work, Helen, I mean, I think a great example of this is what you do in that, is it the Liberty University, what's that article called? The one where you...
Is it Loyola University?
The Loyola, I knew it was
about,
an L.
about
Yes,
parents'
yes, yes.
rights with respect to their children's
yes.
education and it making the
Yes.
objective case.
Yeah, so she makes a beautiful case that the church's teachings on sexuality and marriage are not just some random rule completely unrelated to the core theology, but that in fact it's absolutely bound up with our vision of God, marriage as an image of the Trinity and so on. And she puts it beautifully there. So I think that's one example of how this can be done, is that you see the attractiveness of the teaching, but you also see its centrality to the core religious doctrines. And that even strengthens the case for why a religious freedom claim is necessary.
Great. So one last question of mine, and it relates to Professor Scherz's discussion of technology. I was thinking that so much of what you talk about relates to the moral concerns that we face, maybe the pastoral concerns. I was thinking about it, especially as it relates to religious liberty concerns. The first thing that came to my mind, what are the implications of this for religious liberty, are basically proliferation of claims, right? And so in other words, once you're manipulating your body in this way, or able to, that creates all kinds of opportunities for conflict with Catholics and other religions who are basically like, no, nothing doing. I'm interested in other implications. In other words, what are the further consequences? Another one that kind of was a little maybe more dimly occurring to me has to do with this idea that was discussed this morning at greater length about how the ability to choose ends undermines the givenness of the ends. I just was hoping to kind of invite sort of further discussion about precisely how these developments in technology affect religious liberty as such.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a proliferation of claims as to what should be allowed. Also, rights to manipulation in certain ways. So people are trying to get around some of the, there's on the fringe still, but I could see these going forward. And some of the big wealthy transhumanists are probably willing to put money behind this kind of a right to use some of these kinds of techniques and technologies on your
Once
body.
you can, it's legally protected, and maybe that legal protection is comparable to what religious freedom might be.
Yeah. So you have that, and then the pushing back against kind of Catholic and religious institutions who don't want to engage in those or allow those.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I'm happy to open the floor. Again, we have 2 microphones. Bishop Conley.
Here, okay, here. Bishop Conley, Diocese of Lincoln. And I just want to thank Aaron and Bishop Rhoades and the committee for putting together such a great day. This is such a very important conversation and assembling a dream team of thought leaders that really are the lights in this whole issue. And I just want to thank them. And I'm also the Episcopal Advisor to the Catholic Medical Association. So I just came from the annual education conference this weekend in Orlando. And the topic was right along this line. It was Imago Dei, that we're created in the image and likeness of God. And we had 750 Catholic physicians, and we had a record number, 75 medical students and residents. And I always have a little get-together with the medical students and residents. And one of the things that the fourth-year medical students were so concerned about, as they're looking at residency programs and beginning interviews, preparing for the matches this March as they go to residency, are state laws protecting religious liberty and freedom. And they're looking at various residency programs, OB/GYN, general practice, but they also are looking at the state laws, which they've never had to worry too much about that. because they're just looking for specialties so this is such an important issue. This conference was very good. We had some great speakers. Carter Sneed spoke, Christian Collier from Michigan, MD, PhD. And this whole question of religious freedom and protection of conscience rights was so much at the center. But I just wanted to mention just 3 little anecdotes that I think show a sign of hope, in this crazy culture in which we live. First, it was on my way to the conference in Orlando. I was in the airport at my connecting flight in St. Louis, and there was a young adult in front of me, and I was getting something at the airport, and she turned around and she had this T-shirt that said, "No more rules." And I looked at her, and she looked at me. And I think she blushed. I know I blushed. But that's just a little anecdote. And there was an awkwardness. I mean, she wasn't really confident with that T-shirt, I don't think, especially when she saw me like this. The second thing is, in the midst of the great speakers we had, thanks to Dr. Patrick Hunter, who's a pediatrician in Florida, assembled 7 detransitioners to come and tell their stories.
Wow. 7.
5 females and 2 males. And it was so very interesting because they were all under 30, and the females had started when they were in their teenage years. And the 3 of the 5 had top surgery, and we had a number of plastic surgeons there who gave a presentation about what's going on in the medical field, right? And so they told their stories, and of the 7, 2 just converted to the Catholic faith after detransitioning, and 3 had come back to the Catholic faith during their whole transition period. And one of the things that struck me, several, was that, and I think we said at the beginning this morning, they were not sure where they belonged. They were disembedded from any community. And that they had been living in this virtual world. The common denominator was social media for all of them.
Really?
And that this lack of contact with the real world. And one of them said, if my mom would have just, when I was 15, if my mom would have just taken me outside, and I could plant a garden, and to be contact with real things. I didn't know there was a real world. The only world I knew was this world in front of me on the screen. And that lack of contact with real things was so important. And that was something that was common among all of them. And it's interesting because there seems to be, talking about religion, Helen was talking about just speaking the truth about religion. There's been this explosion of conversions on Catholic campuses. And on our campus, University of Nebraska, we had 42 college students come into the church at the Easter Vigil. And down at Texas A&M, there were 72 who came into the church this year. And I haven't seen the stats, but I think there's this uptick. Because I think young people are looking around, and this is, Jonathan Haidt points this out in his book, Anxious Generation, is all they've known is this virtual world. And they look around and they see joyful, purpose-filled Catholics, like focused missionaries, who are living their life in a full way, flourishing. And they're saying, wait a second, I want that. This isn't making me happy. What social media is presenting to me to have a happy life, are you kidding me? And then they see people who are living the good life. They want part of that. And so I think that's a great sign of hope, especially in our college campuses. And the third is an interesting thing, and this kind of goes to the nuns. So I came over in an Uber, and I was late, missed Mass, sorry. I have to say Mass later on. Anyway, I got in the conversation with the Uber driver, who was a guy from Colombia, and was born here and had 8 years of Catholic school, but after he graduated from high school, he quit the church, and he told me that. He's 40 years old now. But he said, I'm looking around, he says, everything's crazy. And we talked about transgenderism, we talked about abortion, we talked about end-of-life issues, and he was in agreement with all these things. And I said, well, maybe you ought to go back to Catholic Church. And he goes, well, I think I might, Bishop. he hasn't stepped foot in a Catholic church, probably in 20 years. But I'm just saying that's an example of a 40-year-old, who's a nun, but yet is now taking, a second look at things. Anyway, those are just 3 anecdotes. No.
Well, actually, I don't know if there's any. Okay.
Nathaniel Hurd from the Stand Together philanthropic community. First of all, what a delight to be able to listen to conversations between friends. So thank you for that. The administrative state, so massive federal, state, and local bureaucracies that are often far from the people whose lives they're affecting with the rules, the regulations, and other administrative decisions they make. One might argue that, well, let me run through just some very quick propositions and then a question. So you might argue that the administrative state is one of the most, maybe the most significant immediate threat to Catholic institutions. So that's proposition number one. Proposition number two is that the administrative state is fundamentally incompatible with a culture of religious liberty. The third would be that the administrative state is incompatible with subsidiarity and with a culture of subsidiarity and love for and care of nature. People basically thinking like the government is just going to take care of people. I have no obligation to my neighbor. The fourth is that it is necessary but insufficient to react to threats from and other consequences from the administrative state. In other words, litigation is essential, commenting on proposed rules and regulations is essential, but that it is fundamentally insufficient. Now it's very easy, I mean, you're a bishop, you're a leader of a lay Catholic institution, to look at all of this and say, look, these are just fights between Democrats and Republicans, between some mix of conservatives and libertarians and progressives and integralists, et cetera. But this is, or to characterize it as political, but this is something we should fundamentally stay out of. But if you accept all or most of these propositions, the bottom line question is, what should the church do to address the administrative state more fundamentally, not just react to it, but more fundamentally? And by the church, I mean in particular bishops, lay leaders of Catholic institutions, of which there are many, theologians, attorneys, scholars, and others. So that's my question.
I'll start. I'm very, not my positive self on that, not my cheerful self. We have an entire center at Scalia Law, the Gray Center for the Administrative State, and it's completely in agreement with almost everything you said, including we have a lot of Catholics associated with it on your subsidiarity point. But the administrative state is not simply the province of one party. Everybody who gets in goes nuts and issues more pages in a year than in the first 90 years of our democratic republic. I don't know how you get away from that except citizen movements, particular politicians speaking out against it. But, I'm very, I just wouldn't know how to stop it at all. It's just every party wants what they want and uses the administrative state to get it now. You can foot vote. You can go to states that have less. But as for the feds, I'm not very sanguine. I don't know if anyone else has any.
I mean, I don't have any great solutions. I mean, one small glimmer of hope on this front, I think, is the current court's willingness to push back and place some significant limits on what agencies can do without clear authorization from Congress. And so I think that can at least prevent some of the worst of it. I think when something actually has to pass a legislative body, it's unlikely to run completely roughshod over religious liberty concerns, because there will be enough constituents that you just won't get the votes for it, right? So the danger is, of course, that what can never get passed legislatively can get done, with the stroke of a pen through legislative rulemaking. And that, all the HHS, all sorts of other issues have all been, as you know, right, have all been creations of the administrative state. So I think the fact that the current court is saying, unless there's clear legislative mandate for this rule that you're making, we're not going to allow it. I mean, that at least is a glimmer of hope. So to the extent that we can keep litigating to shrink the power of the administrative state, I think that's one strategy.
Bishop.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you for your excellent talks. There's something I would like to go back to the issue of truth and religion. Mm-hmm. This is, I found very interesting, and we had I think it was in June, where there was a conference at Notre Dame Law School on depolarizing religious liberty. Were you there, Melissa?
No, but I heard about it. Aaron told me about it.
Oh, okay. And I had to struggle somewhat with that, in the sense of, there were excellent scholars, but some of our allies on religious liberty, I really didn't see eye to eye. You mentioned two of them. And this is where I gave a talk at that. And I really, as you described religion as a basic human good, and you mentioned natural law, and you mentioned about recognizing this through reason. And I resonate so much with all of that, because I think there is bad or corrupt religion. Mm-hmm. And there's something that we have as Catholics, that whole, the faith and reason. There's dangers with fideism. Mm-hmm. And whether we should even call some of that religion, maybe we should call it ideology rather than religion. I'm not quite sure, but what I was, when I was reading, Dignitatis Humanae, studying it more before that conference, it kept striking me, the issue that there is some limits here. There are limits here. They speak of, what is it, the public order,
right,
or we might say common good, but right, and all of that. And I just felt that was so important, because there are it's not all about religious freedom, it's also other rights, the right to life, for example, or, justice. So I'm thinking about all of this, but then some of our allies, I was noticing, they were very critical of the U.S. bishops, because when we didn't support certain compromises, again, this gets back to the depolarizing, but if depolarizing means that then we compromise with some fundamental truths. In one case where we did not go along with the expansion of same-sex marriage, because we say that is harmful. Or
was that on the same-sex marriage religious freedom thing, the Equality Act, or whatever
yes,
that was?
all of that back then.
Equality
and we got, the bishops got heavily criticized for that. Yeah. And actually, after I gave my talk at Notre Dame in June, a Muslim woman came up to me, very sweet, and she said, the only thing is, how can you're not really respecting our religious liberty. I didn't know Muslims allowed for abortion in the early months, but whatever Muslim group she was part of, they did. And I said, because there are other rights besides religious liberty. There's the right to life, so that we don't allow things that are going to do harm to others. So somehow natural law has to come in here, and faith and reason. And I guess I'm trying to figure out, how do we concretely, I don't think we want to define religion or religious liberty in a way that somehow gives license for evil, harm. If you can.
Yeah, I think that this is always the difficulty, both with religious freedom and conscience rights more broadly, is that there's both an objective element and a subjective element. So, Thomas Aquinas is very clear, a sincere but erring conscience nonetheless binds, And so there's at least a presumption of respecting people's conscientious beliefs, but there are also limits, because the conscience could be in error, and if it's in error in a way that is seriously harmful to others or to the common good, there can be legitimate limits placed on that. And the same is true with religious freedom. Now, I think a lot of these claims, like the Muslim who claims a duty to an abortion, a lot of these claims are simply spurious, right? So I think on the one hand, the Aztecs might have sincerely believed that they had an obligation to, engage in human sacrifice to placate the gods. Does that mean that that was right? Does that mean that if we have Aztecs among us that we need to give them a religious exemption? Obviously not, right? Because there's a clear right of a third party and a clear threat to the common good involved when you take innocent life, right? So even if that's clearly a religion and clearly a sincere belief, it doesn't mean it necessarily has to be tolerated in law if there's some other objective, important good that is being violated there. But I think a lot of these claims are spurious, and they're also mixing up religious permissions and religious obligations. And I think that permissions and obligations have a very different status. Law restricts our ability to do what we feel ourselves permitted to do all the time. Every law does that, right? There are lots of things that in conscience we think we might be permitted to do. In conscience, I think I ought to be permitted to drive 40 miles an hour on Michigan Avenue. But according to the law, and if I go past that speed camera and I'm going 30, I'm going to get a ticket, right? I might disagree with that law, but that's not fundamentally unjust, right? This is part of the discretion of the lawmaking authorities to set speed limits and so on and so forth for the protection of human life. I'm not going to call that a religious freedom violation because, according to my understanding of my religious beliefs, I'm acting responsibly and within my liberty as a Christian, St. Paul says, right, to go 40 on Michigan Avenue. That's a spurious claim, right? But if there was some argument that there was a religious obligation or a religious requirement that I was unable to fulfill because of the law, that's a totally different thing. So I think the difference between permissions and requirements are also very important when we're getting to these sorts of claims. But then, in addition, there's the issue of recognizing the objective limits of religious freedom claims because there are also other rights and other legitimate concerns that the state has. And so it's not, even on the strongest version of a religious freedom claim, I think generally strict scrutiny for religious freedom claims is a good idea. But even on the strongest version of that, right, it's when your ability to fulfill your religious obligations is being impinged upon by a state action, that's only justifiable if there's a compelling interest and it's narrowly tailored. Well, that's met in the case of abortion when you recognize there's a human life, right? Protecting people against murder is a compelling state interest, and narrowly tailored means protecting it against every individual, right? So I think even on the strongest claim, you can make those distinctions.
One quick thing I forgot to mention. When we were getting pressured, Anthony, I think you might have been involved in this. When we were getting pressured to, the bishops that is, to support this religious liberty, where we were going to be given these exemptions, like everyone said, oh, this is great, but you have to go along with allowing the expansion of same-sex marriages to other states. I mean, that's where we just couldn't do it because then but anyhow, I wanted to explain why. Yeah.
Right. No, I agree, and I would also just add on that has been a tactic for a long time, saying, oh yeah, just redefine marriage in law, but then we'll protect your religious freedom. But then they're going to come back for you. That's not actually, and we clearly saw it happen with Obergefell, right? They said, oh, no, you'll be able to do what you want, and now they're litigating to try to stop people from following their religious beliefs. So that's not even a true compromise on the other side.
I wanted to add, as Catholics, we don't have to worry that we're going to be seen as wanting to interpret religion so broadly to allow anything we want. We have We have a history, we have a community, we have obligations, we have transcendence, we have a long tradition, magisterium, theology. But, there are cases, I think they stretched it in the case of the conscientious objectors. They just reinterpreted the law. But there's also been things, the flying spaghetti monster as a religion, the religion for smoking pot, with Puff the Magic Dragon as their song, and, Captain Boo Boo as their bishop, and then the new Satanic Temple stuff, which is clearly formed strictly to make a religious freedom case for having abortion in states that restrict it. I don't think we have a problem. We know you have to announce a burden. It has to be substantial. The state has to have a compelling interest, least restrictive means, according to, one formulation of it. And we're willing to take real looks at those. We're willing to try to make the case that it's a substantial burden. We're willing to go along with that. So the struggle's coming from the Satanic Temple type stuff, where we want to say, no, you're on the other side of the line. And I think I won't go on because we have other questions, but there's lots of ways that you were formed for purely political reasons. You don't actually have a creed. There's all kinds of ways to go about it, but it's a big topic right now in the literature.
Yeah, and I think to add just at the end, this shows the importance of separating out conscience from religious liberty, conscious rights from religious liberty, because conscience pretty clearly applies mainly to negative obligations. I don't have to participate in something that violates my integrity, whereas religious liberty has more of these positive permissions that go along with it.
Mary.
Yeah, so thank you again, fantastic panel. Just to pick up on the truth point that Bishop Rhoades was making. I mean, it seems to me that unless the Supreme Court goes further and is willing to say, or backtrack, you might say, that religion is good, there is a God, or at least we're going to say as a court, we're not going to be neutral between religion and irreligion, we're going to weigh in on that side. It's hard for me to see, even though all the arguments you said, they'll work in some courts, are they really going to work? I don't know. And here's an example of why I'm concerned about it. So there are people who are allies against gender transitioning of kids, who one of their objections as to why that's a bad thing goes to Abby's subjective point. They say, well, when you talk about this inner essence of gender, you're talking about you having a gender soul, and that's just a religion. And that's just crazy. And so they say, this is a religion, you can't embed that in our schools, et cetera. And there are people on our side who will say, that's a crazy religion, which that puts everything up for grabs. But in a culture where we have let go of the idea of truth, how do we get back to that? What do we do about things like that?
That case, and you'll know these cases, Mary, reminds me when they first started instituting series of readings in school books, whether it was, Heather Has Two Mommies, or whether it was stuff that involved like witchcraft or transhumanism or alien beings and stuff. And parents pushed back, the Mozart versus the Hawkins. Hawkins case and a couple. Some of them, they tried to characterize what the school was doing as a religion. And the court has never bought that. They've never said that a world without God and populated by these other things is religion. And so, because otherwise, that's sort of an analog to the question of conscience versus religion, but on the flip side of defining religion, which is, well, then anything would be a religion. That is, a worldview. Even if it's not a comprehensive worldview. So far, now again, the Satanic Temple people formed for purposes of empowering abortions is going to be. I don't know if the Supreme Court will take it. I think they'll dodge it like a bowl of wet spaghetti, because they would end up having to say this falls on the other side of religion. When, as you discussed in your morning panel, and Thomas versus Review Board, they're like anything that isn't bizarre. Okay, flying spaghetti monster is bizarre, but Satan, well, he's been around for a while. So I'm just not as sure. I think it's going to float around. Just all I can say is this idea of transgender soul, and therefore it's a religious argument. I don't see them buying that for the same reason that they're afraid to give any comprehensive or even partial worldview religious status.
Yeah, two quick things on that. One, I think that that Helen's right. The court's not going to buy that. However, I do think that there's a line of argument that can be made there that the schools teaching that and teaching these ideologies is not neutral between religions.
Agreed.
Right? So this is clearly a view that's being taught in schools that is more favorable to certain liberal or progressive theologies than it is to conservative denominations and theologies. And I think if there's anything that is a kind of constant in all of our jagged establishment clause jurisprudence, it's that the state has to be neutral between different religious views and denominations. And so here we see the state basically taking sides on and favoring a progressive theological stance or a liberal theological stance as against a conservative one. And so on that, I think you could get them, even without calling it religion, but just saying it aligns solely with one side of the divide. But then, secondly, on the Satanic Temple issue, I think it's interesting. There's a parallel here to the U.S. v. Quaintance case, where it was clearly a made-up religion. They made up something about being required by their religion to travel with drugs. They were drug traffickers, right? And they were trying to get an exemption from drug trafficking regulations. And the court just said, this is made up for the purposes of trying to get around the regulations. And I think you can say the same thing on the Satanic Temple case.
All right, so we are actually a couple minutes over, but we have a few more questions. So what I'd like to do is invite those who are still here to present questions to kind of put them all out on the table all at once. And then we can take as many responses from the panel as we might briefly, and then maybe the conversation can continue offline. So with that, maybe Matt, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Matt Bowman with ADF. Is there an opportunity now to promote religious liberty in certain states, maybe that we didn't have before? I'm thinking Dobbs deferring power to the states, the Lemon Test is gone, the administrative state at the federal level is being restricted, and we're getting some religious liberty and some laws passed at the state level that say men are men and women are women. And is that an opportunity we should be looking at? That's my question.
Okay, thanks. Ma'am, please, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Teresita Rios. I'm with Compass Legal and Napa Legal. So I think a good resource that one of the bishops asked was where we can find laws or a guideline of what states are more friendly towards religious organizations. So that's what I do. I'm an attorney and I do all the transactional side and all the administrative trying to navigate. So Napa Legal has a free map with all of that Napa Legal is Catholic, so I think that's a good resource to keep in mind. Another issue so I'm visually impaired, I'm blind, and another issue that I have trouble with, especially because I grew up in this atmosphere. I went to UCLA for undergrad, and so I was imbued with identity talk. An issue that I have when trying to connect with people is well, I'm disabled, therefore I should understand transgender problems. The ADA is kind of clear in the sense that I'm asking for help and I have to ask for reasonable accommodations. I don't hear that from the transgender movement. And how can the Catholic, in a very loving way, say, well, is this a reasonable accommodation that you're asking from us? Interesting. So what do you guys think about that?
Great, thank you. Sir.
Yes, I'm John Mueller with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I have 2 points. Actually, I will add a third point, which is a shout out to Rice Hasson for having written the best book on religious liberty so far, which is The Right to Be Wrong. My other comments is to ask us to think more carefully about what exactly we mean by religion. And I want to, my last point is to provide a provisional answer. As Helen Alvaré requested in empirical form. Aristotle lived in a very different religious universe than we do. 4,000 years ago, takes us back to Abraham, and in 1800 BC there were approximately 4 dozen monotheists in the world. That number had shrunk to roughly 0%, only a fraction of a hundredth of a percent by the time Jesus was born. But ever since then, there has been a clear trend from polytheism. Everybody back at the time of Aristotle was a polytheist, and polytheism is not really a religion. So that's by way of clarifying my request that we think more clearly about it, what exactly we mean by religion. And I think the empirical trends are pretty clear that from 0% of the world population at the time of Christ, the percentage has risen to about 2/3 of the world population are monotheists today, and preform projections are that it will continue to expand for the foreseeable future. So I suppose this is partly a way to inject a positive note in that I think there has been an understandable tendency on our part to see the glass as 3/4 empty rather than a quarter full or half full. And if you look at the world population as a whole today, rather than say at the European or the American population today, you get a wholly different picture. And someone mentioned the percentage of the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. That percentage is actually declining and will continue to decline for a very simple reason, is that people who don't believe in God don't have children. So I'll just stop there. And
Thank you.
thank you.
All right. So any responses to the various questions briefly while we...
I would say 2 things. One, it's so interesting to me, and I see it at Scalia Law, which has a reputation to be against the administrative state and force free speech, that we're also really attracting a lot of religious students. And it's now become, especially free speech, an aspect of it. And so, I do think we've always had a country of many choices between states for the state personality and law, and I think that's just, it's more visible now. It was always the case, but it's far more visible now, and the idea that there's sort of metrics of this that we can take advantage of is a terrific thing, and I do think there's a moment for it, because the sense of being overwhelmed by regulation and interference in ways that absolutely don't need it at all with speech. There's no urgent state need. I think it is an opportune moment. Then finally, I think this idea on the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I have not seen a case put in the ADA vein, in part because I think to be told that my desire to be another sex is a disability would be perceived to be an incredible insult to some people. Some people might put it that way. The others will say that's not a disability, it's actually the source of my happiness or freedom or person. But if it does come up, I think this reasonable accommodation aspect of the law is a really cool thing to explore. So thank you.
Yeah, I think on the disability front, there's been, so disability is an administrative category, kind of from the ADA, but there has been a big push for people to kind of think of disability as an identity rather than as this kind of, there's different kinds of disability. So there's a lot of people in the disability rights arena are pushing back at it, and I think this is a debate within disability rights over should we try to think of disability as an identity, which transgender would then fit in as another identity, or should it keep this administrative and medical kind of area, which I think would be preferable. In terms of religion and like the optimism and pessimism, I agree that we should not be pessimistic, but also if we want to be optimistic, we have to act, right? So I don't think there's any kind of, inevitable trend lines, but we should be active on these fronts.
Yeah, I think also on the disability point, I mean, I think it's a parallel problem of, calling disability an identity has the same problems as calling religion an identity, as opposed to an objective reality, right? And so once it becomes an identity, it can include anything and becomes unworkable, and so it actually then be harmful for the genuine necessary claims of genuinely disabled people. Although I think the desire for opportunistic purposes, bring in these sexual expressionist identity claims is similar to the kind of catch-22 that they have in terms of trying to bring in claims of medical necessity for the treatments, quote unquote, right? Because on the one hand, they want to say, well, my identity is normal. It's not a disease. It's not even a psychological problem. And yet, on the other hand, they need a diagnosis to get the pills and the surgeries and so on. And so that a lot of this is on a collision course with itself. It's just not really coherent. But then, lastly, on the religion point, there was a mention of polytheism. And while, of course, I believe that monotheism is true, I think legally, I think we should be generally capacious of any genuine religion. And I think any definition in law of religion that excludes some major world historic religious tradition is going to be problematic. So I think we have to allow for polytheism, which is still theistic, right? It has to be theistic, but it doesn't necessarily have to be monotheistic, in my view, to count as a religion for legal purposes.
Yeah. No, I mean, defining religion is going to be very difficult. I just came from a religious studies department, and so, it is a mess.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.
So we have about 25 minutes. It'll probably actually be less than that. I think that they should be setting up down in the lower level for happy hour. But we did want to allow some time before the shrine officially closes for people to, I think the bookstore's open till like 3:30. So if you want to go to the bookstore, there's a John Paul II exhibit downstairs. There are beautiful chapels. So please, take the opportunity to with this break time to go visit those places. And then, again, thank you to the Center for Law and the Human Person, are sponsoring our happy hour at 3:30. So come on down, and I hope that our conversation can continue downstairs. Thank you very much.